All right. Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well. Hello, Elizabeth. I hope it's a lovely day where you are. We're having a nice light drizzle here. I am Dr. Joanna Broussard, a qualitative research specialist with Statistics Solutions, a full-service dissertation consulting company, and I am here to deliver the literature review webinar to help guide you through chapter 2 of your dissertation. This will be about a 1-hour presentation. I have the webinar chat up in the bottom right corner of my screen. That will allow me to see any questions you have. I guess it's good afternoon for those of you in France. As someone who was born a little bit to your east in Germany, I'm glad France is sunny this time of year and this time of day. But I have the webinar chat up. And I also have the Q&A ready. There will be time at the end, usually for some questions. However, I do like to have the question, have you be able to, hello from Kazakhstan. I do want you, as we get started, to be able to ask your questions as they go along, and I will try to answer them because, hello, Lauren from the US of A. You will receive in a few days a recorded version of the webinar, and I want you to be able to have the content, your question, and the response as close together. Well, hello to Nigeria. And Argentina. I used to have family in Argentina, but that's a different story. Ooh, another from Kazakhstan and from Zimbabwe. Hello, everyone. I see everyone's chatting. I'm glad to hear that. But it is 11:02 Eastern Time in the United States, so it is time to get started and talk about the literature review. So, before we begin, let's talk about the contents of your literature review, the introduction, your literature search strategy, your theoretical framework, your review of the literature, and your summary. So, if you haven't had someone tell you this, academic writing has a very consistent structure. It is tripartite. You have an introduction where you tell us what you're going to tell us. You have a body where you tell it to us in all of the glorious detail that you can. And then you have a conclusion where you tell us what you just told us and help us move smoothly to whatever is going to come next. This structure works on everything from the paragraph to the essay, to the research paper, to a dissertation or book chapter, and to the dissertation itself. So once you realize that is the structure you need to be working from, it makes seeing how things come together a lot easier. So for the literature review, the introduction is the introduction. The search strategy, theoretical framework, and the review of literature is your body, and the summary is your conclusion. So that is how we will be structuring things. We will be talking about each part in greater detail so that you know what goes there. And I will try to give you some examples from my research, which deals with masculinity, suicide, post-traumatic stress disorder, as well as heroic narrative. So a lot of things that feed into some darker elements, but we will talk about things and how we work with literature. So let us move forward. The introduction. There are 3 things you have to do here. You have to restate the purpose of your study. Now, you've stated this and you've talked about it in great detail in chapter 1, but as with anything, you need to restate and remind your audience, remind your reader why you are doing this study. What is your purpose? Then you need to remind your reader of the importance of it and why it is needed. All of this you've talked about in the introduction. You will talk about them in the introduction to chapter 3 and chapter 4 as well. This is keeping all of these big ideas fresh in your reader's mind. So that way they know, okay, once again, this is fresh. We're talking about this. So now we're going to get some literature that shows how we got here. And then you will preview the contents of your chapter. You want to end your introduction with a fairly detailed preview, talking about some of the big main ideas of each section. So that way your reader has an understanding of where they're going to go. The introduction is basically reading someone directions from a map or from, say, Google Maps, MapQuest, things like that, and saying, okay, this is how we're going to get there. Now let's go take the trip in detail. You're setting up the trip. You want to let us know what we're going to experience on the trip through the preview, and you want to get us excited to take the journey with you. That is what you need to do in the introduction. Okay? Now, the literature search strategy is something that when I finished my dissertation, this wasn't a thing because we were still getting used to having databases, but it's become a thing since databases have become a place where we find most of our literature. This is where you will describe in detail the method and execution of finding the research that you will present in the literature review. What databases did you use? What search tools did you use? Be specific in these. This is not the place for, oh, I went to my university's library website and clicked on online databases. Did you go to JSTOR? Did you go to LexisNexis? Did you go to Academic Search Complete? Did you search something specific to your field? Did you use Google Scholar? Did you perhaps look through, say, a microfiche collection of old newspapers? Did you go to a special collections archive to search for manuscripts, manuscript facsimiles, and rare books or rare magazines or other rare documents? The university that I went to had a very nice collection of medieval manuscript facsimiles. It also had quite a comprehensive collection of economic ledgers from various plantations and large farms in the area. So that way, if you wanted to know something about the economics or maybe the daily life of running a farm or running a plantation in 1854, you would go to that special collections. They also had an amazing collection of 6,000 Silver Age comic books, which, while it was not part of my research, it was fun to go and look through those. But if you use a special collection, talk about going to the special collection, talk about searching for it. As for some of the research I did in graduate school, I looked at the rhetoric of magical charms in Anglo-Saxon health manuals from the 7th, 8th, and 9th century. I actually did get a chance to go to the British Museum and look at the manuscript. So I would talk in that research, I would talk about, say, the process of getting vetted to go to a place like the British Museum. I had to have letters of reference from multiple scholars in the fields, not just saying my research was important, but vouching for my character, because these were manuscripts of which there were between 1 and 3 in the entire world. I talk about the process. I would talk about the process of going to the room, having my bag taken from me by one of the security agents and held so that way I could only have my cellular phone for camera purposes, and I could only have loose leaf paper and a pencil. I was then escorted to a table where the manuscript was brought to me. Because these are actual parchment, no white gloves. With parchment, because it is animal hide, they want the oils in your fingers to touch the pages to keep them supple. When we move from parchment to early paper, that's when you use white gloves, because otherwise the oils on early paper will make it start to disintegrate. So I would talk about that in all of this section, because that is a special place. And it's something that, people need to know, that this is how you conduct, if you're conducting this type of research, this is what you need. This is what you had to go through to do it. It's part of the establishing yourself process. If you use specialized journals, there are some fields that have very specific and very niche journals. If you are studying rhetoric, there are certain rhetorical theorists like Kenneth Burke. There are journals dedicated solely to working with Burkean thought and the Burkean understanding of rhetoric. Did you search through those journals? If you do, specifically mention them. Talk about the keywords that you use, the combinations of keywords that you use to search. Let's say you were searching for information on performance of masculinity through boasting in medieval poetry. You could search medieval poetry, boast contests plus medieval poetry, boast contests plus masculinity, gender plus medieval poetry, gender plus boast contest plus medieval poetry plus masculinity. What combinations did you use? What worked? What didn't work? Part of this isn't just recounting the tale of how you studied and researched for your dissertation. It's helping other scholars who come after you see what works. Not every search term will yield fruitful results. Not every combination yields the results you need. So being able to describe in detail what worked, what didn't work, helps everyone see the picture and helps those who come after you understand the process and how to maybe go about it in a more efficient manner. And be certain to use any qualifiers. How did you filter your search? If you search for certain topics, Beowulf, suicide, post-traumatic stress disorder, capitalism, socialism, the Second World War, colonialism, you're likely to return hundreds of thousands of results. That is overwhelming. So, did you look for, what features did you use to sort of narrow down your criteria? Did you look for English-only sources? If you're in America, you will probably be doing a lot of English language only searching unless there's a necessity. Say you're looking for something dealing with a particular country or particular culture, then you might add then the languages spoken in that country or by that culture, because that could be meaningful and important. Do you want full text only? Abstracts are nice, but if you're looking for sources to really be helpful, an abstract doesn't give you the full picture, just a brief summary. Date of publication. Most dissertations want you to focus on recent literature. 5 to 7 years is usually about the time they suggest. Historical linguist Calvert Watkins, the late Calvert Watkins, always said, any source over 10 years old needs to be a seminal study, or it is academically prehistoric. It doesn't mean it was bad at the time, doesn't mean it wasn't meaningful, but especially now, as fast as we move, as fast as technology has allowed research to be done, older sources are outdated for how we talk about, think about, and understand situations as scholars today. Like I said, is it a seminal study? For my dissertation, which did look at how heroic discourse plays into the likelihood of veterans seeking treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder and suicidal ideation. When talking about suicide, the first study I mentioned was Emil Durkheim's Suicide. Yes, that was published in 1897, but it was the first major sociological analysis of suicide as a phenomenon. And so it is it is something I had to include because of its import to the study of suicide. We may not have begun studying it for who knows how long if Durkheim did not open the door. And so that is an exception to the recency rule, but any exception needs to be justified. And did you filter only peer-reviewed academic articles? Did you filter newspapers? What did you use to qualify? How did you limit the results? Anything that helps people understand your thought process for what you thought was important, what was meaningful to look for, how you narrowed it down, is something you need to describe in your literature search strategy. Now, the theoretical framework and a discussion of that will come next if and only if your school's template requires it. Not all schools require this in the literature review chapter. Mine did not. Mine wanted it in the introductory chapter. So that is a place you may also have it, but if your school wants it in the chapter 2, this is where you would place it. You will likely have an extended discussion of it in chapter 1, as I've already said. Most schools want at least something talking about the theoretical framework you're using in the introduction, because that helps set the stage. But here is a way you can tell more of a narrative of how we move from the theoretical framework that you're using to its importance for your study. Think of a lot of what you were doing in the literature review as telling sort of a genealogical narrative, how we began with these ancient revered ancestors, and we have now moved to my study, how I am bringing the conversation forward into new directions, but it is building upon the work of those who came before. So let's talk about your theory. Who developed it? When did they develop it? This may be one of those exceptions to the recency requirement of literature. I mentioned rhetorical theorist Kenneth Burke. Kenneth Burke developed most of his work between the 1930s and the 1960s. It's quite dated by contemporary standards, but if you are a rhetorical scholar studying Burkean thought, you have to discuss first what Kenneth Burke said about this particular aspect of rhetorical theory. What did he say? When did he say it? What books did he write it in? Why did he develop this? What was he seeking to explain? And with any theorist, what was the theory developed to explain? What aspect of our understanding of economics, of education, of social interaction, communication, literature, chemistry, biology, disease transmission? What were they trying to explain with the theory that they developed? In this process, you will define the theory, in as much clarity and detail as you can. You will also define any associated components, major concepts, instruments that you are using, because you want to have all of these definitions presented clearly and in detail. One, you cannot guarantee that everyone who reads your dissertation, even on your committee, will be an expert in this theoretical framework. A lot of people I've noticed since I started working here have a chair who should be an expert either in the theory or in the method or on the subject matter. You may have a methods person and you may have a content specialist or a theory person. Since you want to have the committee work together, you try to pick people with different strengths. We do have another webinar that focuses on committee selection that we offer at different times throughout the year, if that interests you. But because not everyone is as familiar with everything in your study, you want to be thorough in detail in your descriptions and definitions of theory, components, instruments, concepts, so that way everyone moves forward with at least a standardized baseline understanding. You know, and then from there you will move to discuss what have people done with this? What have researchers used this theory for? Have they built upon it? Have they pulled apart and critiqued the components? Have they adapted it to new situations that didn't come about while the theorists were working on the theory or while they were alive, depending on it? What has been done with the theory by others after it came into being? And through this, you will go from the theorist to the other researchers who have used it down to your study. How does this theory help explain what you are studying? How will this theory be a good framework for responding to the question that you have posed as the central question of your research? How will this help you explain the problem and provide even a step toward a solution? Everything moves from older research to where you are and where you are bringing these topics. That is how you move each section of your literature review. From the giants to the middle scholars to you as an emergent scholar. Now, we will move on from your theoretical framework to your review of the literature. This is where you will primarily cover recent literature on your subject matter, your factors, your variables, your major concepts. Again, using my dissertation on how heroic discourse impacts the likelihood of soldiers and veterans to seek treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder and suicidal ideation. I looked at heroic rhetoric in the United States, because that was the focus of my dissertation. Warrior heroism. What are the concepts of warrior heroism, how it connects to masculinity, the ideal of the perfect soldier. I looked at literature on the history of PTSD and its development, from even mentioning some of the history in the ancient world to how it was talked about in the Middle Ages, through the First, Second World War, to when it was given names like shell shock, Kriegsneurose, up until around the Vietnam conflict, when it was then renamed by the American Psychological Association post-traumatic stress disorder, and how the name and how that's been evolving to possibly being renamed post-traumatic stress injury, a discussion that has been ongoing in military psychological circles. I also looked at suicide rates amongst veterans. I looked at the link between suicide and PTSD. And I had sections discussing all of these things. So that way we could, and I traced how each one moved from giants to contemporary scholars discussing it, to some of the various things that were in there, to where I was planning to take the study with what I wanted to look at. You will organize this material in sections typically by having a section introduction. So a small intro for each section on each topic, each variable, each concept, and then you will review the research you have found for that topic and then segue to the next section. And each reviewing section, you will do both synthesis, bringing studies together for larger concepts, and detailed analysis of the findings. So let's talk about synthesis. This is where you will combine various parts to form a whole. It's where you will combine the information from multiple studies to make one or more points. Are a lot of people currently talking about your topic in this way? This is where you can talk about a lot of things and get it through very quickly. Your synthesis at the paragraph level will use a standard paragraph organizational strategy. Your topic sentence and introduction will explain and state the concept you're going to be synthesizing and talking about. Then your body will provide evidence and the discussion of the topic. You will present literature on the topic. You will note where findings align and where they differ. And then in your conclusion or your summary, you will have a sentence that summarizes the findings and presents their significance, perhaps also transitioning to the next topic. Let's present an example, shall we? I'm not going to read this to you in its entirety, as when you receive a copy of the webinar, you will be able to do that yourself. So, as you can see, the topic sentence is in yellow, the evidence begins in green, and the summary begins in the blue. So, the topic sentence. Recent research has mostly shown that health literacy is an important factor in diabetic self-control and positive outcomes. So, what are we going to be talking about? Well, the connection between diabetic self-control and positive outcomes in managing one's diabetes. Anders et al. Conducted a systematic review of the concept of health literacy. Gregory et al. Reviewed 115 recent studies. In a quantitative study, Talbot et al. Examined the relationship. However, unlike Anders et al. And Gregory et al., Phillips et al. Found no statistically significant relationship. We synthesize what people are saying on a topic, bringing together a lot of recent research to suggest rhetorically that this is a major topic of scholarly discussion. And then, to summarize, empirical evidence from recent research largely supports that diabetic health literacy is a vital component of patient self-efficacy, diabetic control, and clinical outcomes. We tell you, as you can see, we tell the audience what we're going to talk about. We talk about it in detail, and then we summarize the significance of what we just spoke on, or we just wrote, shall we say. So that way the audience gets a hint, oh, okay, this, okay, this is the one thing I need to take away, that this is what the evidence is talking about, that this is the discussion and where it is. So this is what synthesis is, but in addition to synthesis, you will also need to perform analysis. When you are analyzing research, you will be noting both the findings as well as shortcomings and gaps in the studies. when I was teaching at university, a lot of students from undergraduate even through graduate levels were terrified to say, I think that there's something missing here because, well, these people have been published. These people are named and known scholars. I'm not one of them. I'm just a student. How can I notice this? Because you are looking at it with a different set of eyes and different experiences. And so you are seeing things that they may not have seen. So don't be afraid to point out mistakes, shortcomings, things that scholars haven't talked about. The goal of, if you haven't noticed, as you get more degrees and go from undergraduate to master's to doctorate, you become more specialized in your knowledge. You know a whole lot about a very small topic. And then you know a lot about a few other topics and a decent amount about a few more topics and a little bit about a lot of topics. But your knowledge becomes so focused that it can easily become somewhat myopic. And so as you go into this as a student, you have your own experiences that may be drastically different from these scholars. You know things that they didn't know. Some things that they may not have been able to know because of advances in knowledge and understanding. And so you are coming at it with a fresh set of eyes, new knowledge, different experiences. And so you have the ability to point out, hey, they didn't do this. Maybe they didn't know to. Maybe they didn't think about it. Maybe it's something that didn't emerge until then. Any study that takes place after COVID-19 presents a complication for research that was conducted before COVID-19. Because that is a pandemic that is a once in a generation, once in a lifetime experience for many people. And so it changed many things. As someone who was a teacher both before and after, it changed how we understand how to present information to students. It told universities we need to have a more robust online platform for learning just in case. And it showed many fields that they have to think of new ways to do things. And so researching any topic post-COVID gives a dimension that a lot of research didn't think about. I know I haven't really talked about it yet, but if you think about how long it takes for studies to get published, the average time from the time your paper is accepted to the time it is published is 3 years across most disciplines. And so being 2023, studies that are being published this year were submitted either during 2020 or before. A few journals have rushed out COVID and post-COVID studies to try to get ahead of the curve, but much of the research that's available happened before that. And so this is why we need to think about, you need to think about how that gaps aren't because you're saying they made a mistake. Sometimes they can't know everything that's going to happen after they write something. You can also use your analysis to note trends. It is through analysis that you can start to see things that you can synthesize. If you analyze the data and say, well, this is a trend in research, you will then need to synthesize multiple studies to show that it is a trend. And the same with a gap. Can you show through multiple studies ignoring it that it is not something that is talked about? Michael, you have a question. Should the analysis come before the synthesis? Yes and no. I will answer this live so that way you all can have access to this. these are not things, you are not separating analysis, synthesis. You are probably conducting the analysis while you are reading, because the analysis will help you figure out where to talk about an individual study by itself or how to put things together. But it will not be something that is separate in the presentation. It is something that needs to be joined. Could you theoretically do, this is my analysis of the literature, this is my synthesis? Yes. It will look disjointed and it will look sort of unbalanced. Bring everything together into a harmonious union. That is one of the things that you're dealing with as a rhetorical presentation. Ruben, what do you mean, will you get the material? I'm not entirely sure what you mean by the material. So could you please be more specific? The webinar. As I mentioned earlier, I will mention this later again. You will receive a webinar within, usually within 3 or 4 days. It will be emailed to you, a link for you to download it. So wait on that. But in addition to noting the trends and the gaps, you will need to, again, consider this is how you can reiterate your research problem and the need for your study. Hey, as you can see from this gap that a lot of people have pointed out as a direction that someone needs to take this research in, this is what I'm doing. This is how this study is going to fill this gap. Your analysis needs to always culminate in the argument for conducting your study. Everything needs to move from this is where we began, this is where we are now, and through all of this, you understand this is why my study is necessary. This is how I both continue the tradition of how we in this field talk about this topic, but I am moving us 1, 2, maybe 3 steps farther. I am bringing us into new territory because, as numerous scholars have noted, either through stated gaps or unstated gaps, this is where we need to go. This is where we can fill this gap in the literature. And once you have done that, you will move into your summary. Your summary, first, tell us what you just told us. Recap your major points from the chapter. So what did we talk about? What were some of the big themes in the literature? Did you mention if you talked about your theoretical framework, remind us what it is, hit the big themes, hit the big gaps, bring us then once again to your study, your research problem, and as well as through that problem, what is in the literature connected to the problem, but what is not mentioned. And finally, conclude with a reiteration of the need for your study. And once you have done that, you may want to then segue with a brief sentence saying, and the next chapter will discuss in detail the methodology the researcher will use to carry out this proposed study. This is your literature review. You've got a lot to do here, and it can be quite a learning curve for how to go about searching for literature, especially for older students who maybe came back to school after databases became widely popular and the internet ceased from slow dial-up to fiber optic broadband and other fast services. It may be you may not know how to search for particular topics. Depending on your topic, you may be overwhelmed by the amount of research and then how to narrow it down. Understanding how to read scholarly articles can be a challenge. And so it can be a learning curve, It can take time as you go about searching for your literature and seeking to find it. Okay, Big O, do we critique individual literature? That is a very good question. And the answer is yes. You are not simply reporting Smith, Johnson, and White said onions are delicious. You need to talk about the findings. When you receive your copy of the webinar, you can see in the synthesis paragraph, it wasn't just, hey, these people talked about this topic. Here's what they said. If there is something to critique, perhaps, while this study on race relations in South Carolina only interviewed upper-class white men. Well, the gap is they didn't talk to upper-class white women, middle-class people, lower-class white people, people of color. They got their findings were based on one position, and and you're not going to find a lot of things like that. You'll find it more in older literature. It is perfectly acceptable to critique each piece if there is something worth critiquing. Consider that you don't have time to talk about every source, and so you need to figure out where you're going to spend your time. Important sources should be given more page space, but if there are numerous sources, especially in contemporary literature, talking about similar things, group them together, mention the highlights, talk about, you can critique any major flaws, you can illuminate gaps, talking about things as they become important. Consider that you don't want to spend 40 or 50 pages on your literature review. Most schools want between 10 and 20, with 15 pages being a good middle ground. So depending on how much, and this is 15 pages typed, double spaced, 12 point, either Times New Roman or Courier font. So you want to make sure that what you have will fit in there. You can go a little bit over if it's important, but the literature review should not take up more page count than the results and discussion of your study. You will need to spend a lot of time talking about those because that's the meat. How do we integrate our stance to our particular topic or idea? This is your problem because writing trends tend to be like report. Well, that's going to depend. I can't speak in general in specifics for your particular stance, Nurgle, and we don't have time to do that in a single webinar, but your stance should become clear, one, through your critique of literature, two, in how you present the fight. Keep this in mind. The more you talk about an individual source, like let's say using Durkheim again, if you spend 2 to 3 paragraphs talking about Durkheim's On Suicide versus say 1 to 2 sentences talking about another book on suicide, it will be very clear that you see Durkheim as being more important for your research. Also, your stance should be fairly clear based on your theoretical framework, because a theoretical framework carries with it, whether we like to admit it or not, an ideological understanding. Exactly, Big O. Trends and gaps, the same as a literature gap. This is where you will present. And so by pointing out gaps, what gaps are you pointing out repeatedly? What trends are you noticing? Again, you cannot put every source in your literature review. One, you don't have the time to read or the ability to access everything written on a topic. You don't know every language. You don't have access to every journal. Most schools want your dissertation completed between 1 and 2 years. And so if you spend 1 year on your literature review, that's going to send up a little bit of a yellow flag for your chair that you may be stalling the writing process. So the sources you pick will also help illuminate your stance. Don't think of your stance as something separate, but that is something that you can also talk about in the introductory chapter. Why are you studying this particular topic? For me, I spent some time discussing that, is it correct to use abstracts of literature? Okay, Elizabeth, that's not a bad question. It's not a bad idea to use them, but 2 things. One, you should use more full text than you do abstracts. It should be a noticeable distinction in the frequency of using full text versus abstracts. And 2, make every attempt to get the full text article. Do you have it at your library? Maybe not. Does your library have an interlibrary loan office? If they do, ask them to get you a copy of the study, because they're very, very good at being able to get access to journals, journal issues, special collections that you may not have. You're not limited to only, these days, you are not limited to only what is at your library. If you can access only the abstract through the database your library has, seek out interlibrary loan, or if you have friends at other schools, ask them if they can get you access to it. Most literature states you can identify literature gaps in the recommendations and conclusions, which is in chapter 5. That's not exactly what's in chapter 5. Chapter 5 is your discussion of your findings. You will be discussing gaps in the literature and how your findings either answered them in detail in chapter 5. In chapter 2, you will be pointing out that these gaps exist. Because if these gaps don't exist and we're not aware of them, your study is not necessary. And why should we continue reading it? This is why you point out the gaps in the literature review. Because we have to know that there's a reason for your study. In the introduction and the literature review, you are making the argument that your study was necessary. The introduction, you're getting our attention. You're going, oh, this could be interesting. Yeah, I see this is a problem. I see this is a problem. I see why you're doing this. The literature review, you were illuminating, one, the fact that this hasn't been talked about, or this hasn't been talked about in this way. And so by talking about it in this way, you believe that we can gain new information, that we can answer questions, that we can fill a gap. This is where you're setting up what you're going to do. In chapter 5, you will demonstrate that you have done what you said you were going to do. And you will point out any gaps that maybe remained unfilled. You will point out directions for future research. So that way, just like other studies that you've read as you write your literature review, as you prepare and discuss your topic, that said, hey, future research should talk about this. Future research should go in this direction. You need to finish by doing the same for others. Okay, first off, Sean says, do you have any suggestions on how to balance recent studies with fundamental or older research? You're probably going, Sean, you are probably going to need to have more fundamental studies that are more contemporary studies, because you really need to focus on where we are now. With the older studies, just hit the big ones. Where did we start? Maybe 2 or 3 of the seminal studies, a big middle ground study, and then move into contemporary studies. Most of your literature review needs to be where the conversation is now. As using Kenneth Burke, what we're talking about, Kenneth Burke used the metaphor of the never-ending conversation. And so the study on a particular subject matter is unending. It is something that scholars have talked about before you came to the party. They're talking about it while you're here, and they will talk about it after you are gone. And so in so doing, you need to acknowledge, though, the first people who talked about it, the host of the party, if you will, thank them, pay homage to the great ancestor, to the host of the party. And then you need to talk, and then you need to engage with the current guests who are having their lively conversation. So focus most of your time on, no, a seminal study is not one that has a lot of citations. It might, but a seminal study is the first studies on a topic. Most people will cite seminal studies, but the number of citations is immaterial. It is the first major. Again, Emil Durkheim's on suicide, Professor Tolkien's Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics. That was the first major study of Beowulf. Jakob Grimm's Deutsche Mythologie was the first systematic understanding of Germanic mythology. These studies get cited in that people mentioned that they were done and that we started there. But you don't want to spend all of they're not your theoretical framework. They are sort of the ancestor to whom we pay homage. Okay, Jenna, the majority of your literature is 2001 to 2011 and from similar fields, but not your specific field. It seems to taper off with huge gaps. Does that make most of the literature prehistoric? Yes, it does. That might mean that that's why you have to do this, because maybe your field stopped talking about it and something new has emerged, but it is prehistoric. It is old. If no one in your field or similar fields are talking about this, then you will have to further answer the question, why am I studying this? Why am I studying this? Why is this necessary for me to study? Because if we stopped talking about it over 10 years ago, what new has happened? What's changed? So you'll have to present it that way. That's what you will need to do. Okay, Big O, you said you meant that you get the gaps from the conclusion and recommendations, but report it in the literature review as a subtopic. Okay, now that you say that, I can see that it was your mentioning of chapter 5, which is a different chapter that led to the confusion. But thank you for clarifying. Okay, so that is where this is the literature review. We are running out of time. I do thank everyone for such a lively discussion. And I do want to remind you that Statistics Solutions is a full-service dissertation consulting company, providing graduate students with timely editorial support for your dissertations and other scholarly projects. We can help with master's theses. We can help you convert aspects of your dissertation into journal articles. We go from topic development all the way through preparing your PowerPoint defense. It's been asked again, and as I have said numerous times, you will receive a copy of this in your email within 1 week. Or if you wish to have more information about our services, You can receive a complimentary 30-minute consultation Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 Eastern United States time. You are all very welcome. Please contact info@statisticsolutions.com or phone country code 1 for the United States, 877-437-8622. There is a fee for the services. The fee varies depending on which service you request, all the way from simple hourly rates to full dissertation assistance. And when you receive your consultation, our sales staff will be more than happy to discuss rates, payment plans, and other things with you. So that way you can receive the support you need. We are here. We handle all the way from qualitative to full quantitative. We have experts who are happy, knowledgeable, and ready to assist you. You are all very welcome, and it is Wednesday, so I hope the remainder of your week is filled with happiness, productivity, and one thing that no one tells you in graduate school: rest. You deserve time to rest. So, with that said, thank you for joining us. And if you come to another webinar that I host, I will see you then. If you choose to purchase our services, I may see you then. If not, I wish you all the success in your academic endeavors. Cindy, yes, you need to rest. Trust me. If you don't rest, you will burn out. I know you're told not to rest and to always be writing, but that advice has led many students to get burnout. Take an afternoon to rest. Go for a walk, binge your favorite show, play some video games, cuddle your cats, play with dogs or your pets, spend time with family, spend time with friends, enjoy your favorite meal. Just be. You are worthy of rest. You deserve rest. And I wish you all of the success. Have a lovely day. Have a lovely evening to those who are in Europe, Africa, and the Near East. Bonsoir to those who joined us in France. Unfortunately, I haven't seen any from my homeland. Guten Nacht to those who are from Deutschland if you're here. And good evening, goodbye, good luck. You can do this. Never forget that. You can do this.